Don't do it tonight. I'll try to. Yeah, I'll try to. I'll say, wait. Oh, you want?
Sorry?
Actually, on second thought, let me put it on. You want me to write out tonight? Get into the problem. That would be good, wouldn't it?
Okay, I guess we're all ready, and it's Ukrainian 15 minutes after the announced time. My name is Serhiy Plokhy. I'm the director of the Ukrainian Research Institute and professor of history here at Harvard. And it is my distinct pleasure to introduce to you our today's speaker, but also our distinguished guests. And we're here. I'm trying to figure out where is the right place for my mic. Okay, it looks like it's here. You can still hear me, right? So we are here to mark and celebrate a special occasion. And that occasion is really a movement of the Ukrainian Research Institute into a new and exciting field. And that field is the study of contemporary Ukraine. We were created as an institution to study history, philology, and literature, and humanities in general. And we are very proud of our accomplishments as the institution that did that. But we also think that now, especially in the contemporary environment, it's the right time to move further and approach and take the challenge that comes from contemporary Ukraine and developments, exciting, sometimes tragic, dramatic developments that happen in the region. And we were and are helped in that by the generosity of the Ukrainian community. And in this particular case, by generosity of one man and his family. And I want to welcome James and Louise Demarty today and thank both of you for your vision, for your support of Ukrainian studies all over the world, and for crossing the Canadian-American boundary and coming all the way to the Institute is the place that, as you know, consists of more than one person. There is, apart from director, a number of people who really make the work of the Institute success. So we have a little bit of a distribution of labor here today. And what I was entrusted to do by my colleagues in the Institute is to open this event, which I hope I almost did. I hope it was good. And also to introduce our main supporter, Jim Demarty, today, and present him with a gift, but there is no such thing as free lunch, so before there is a gift, Jim, I'll tell a few words about your really wonderful career. Jim was born in Ukraine, and more specifically in eastern Ukraine, and even more specifically in Donbas region of Ukraine, which is certainly contested today. And he and his family moved to Canada in the year 1950. He worked for IBM before launching an entrepreneurial career, starting with a franchise of Computerland, which he built into the largest chain of Computerland stores in the world. This was followed by founding of Northland Power, which operates wind, solar, and thermal electric power facilities across Canada and Europe, and today enjoys an enterprise value of $12 billion. Along the way, Jim was instrumental in the formation of SoftChoice Corporation, which he chaired for 16 years. He was appointed a member of the Order of Canada in 2008, named Canada's Entrepreneur of the Year in 2010 by Ernst & Young, and in 2015 was honored with Ukraine's Order of Yaroslav the Wise, Ukraine's highest honor granted to a foreigner who has not been head of the state. Jim's philanthropic activities have benefited the Royal Ontario Museum, the Royal Conservatory of Music, Saybrook Hospital, the Center for Addiction and Mental Health, the Ukrainian Catholic University, and many other causes. Always cognizant of his roots, Mr. Terate devotes time to supporting the Holodomor Research and Education Center, founding the Ukrainian Jewish Encounter Initiative, of which I have an honor to be a member of the board, and chairing the National Advisory Council for the Ukrainian Canadian Congress. And I should stress that all of that philanthropic activities, but also business activities, would be really impossible without support of the family. And again, I'm very grateful to Liz for all that wonderful work. And now I'm ready to present a gift, a small token of our appreciation for Jim, your and Liz, your contribution. And this is, I'm not really sure what is inside, but they told me that this is a ball which made out of red oak that grew up on the territory of the Harvard Yard. And this is a big deal for us, and I hope it will be a big deal for you as well. So thank you very much. Thank you very much.
You grew up in the soil of the Donbas, which would make you the second professor that has actually gone back to the place of my birth, but that wasn't the case. The other one was Professor Magochi, who was curious about, where this fellow Jim Kostya in Ukrainian, it's a long story, came from, and he actually found my birthplace, a little place called Koptivo, Ukraine, in the Donbas, just on the outskirts of the front line between the Ukrainians and the Ruski-backed people, and brought back some black topsoil from Ukraine in a little black box. He somehow got it into Canada, and I keep it in my library. But that's not what the talk is about. It's about Harvard. Thank you very much, Serhiy, and thank you for that overly generous introduction. And as I said over dinner, it's been a mission of mine. My mother brought me up a big patriot. My father is a Greek Ukrainian from the Donbas, and in his later years, when he was living with me, my mother had passed away, and he lived with us for the last dozen years or so. In his later years, I said to my father, I called him Dido. I said, Dido, no, ты Ukrainian чи ти Grek? Are you Ukrainian or are you Greek? His mother tongue was Greek, and he was grumbling as he was eating his borscht, and he said, some of you understand Ukrainian? I'll translate. He said, Буркочив, скільки того борщу було треба їсти, скільки вареників, скільки капусти, і щоб стати українцем уже. how much of that borscht and how much of that kapusta and the whole seed that I have to eat to become Ukrainian. So he's thoroughly Ukrainian, thanks to my mother. And he wrote a book that I published with 500 pages of Ukrainian poetry to prove it. But anyway, it's a great honor for Louise and I to be partners in this effort with Emily, especially given that it is here at this institution. So thank you very much, and I wish you all a huge success.
My function is not over yet, so you'll just bear with me for another couple minutes. And what I'm going to use them for is to introduce our today's special speaker, and this is Ambassador John Taft. The proper introduction will be done by Emily Schnell-Justice, the director of the Temerty Contemporary Program on Ukraine, but I wanted to tell a little anecdote from when and how I met John. And John had a mistake of reading one of my books. It's always a mistake. So, and he invited me to Kiev, and I accepted the invitation, but then it turned out that I wasn't an American citizen, and there were some limitations in terms of paying for my ticket. And John did something really extraordinary. He got in touch with the Canadian ambassador, and they sponsored my visit together. So the American-Canadian cooperation really started in Kiev back in the days when John Taft was the ambassador there. So I'll stop here, and I'm passing the mic to Emily Schnell-Justice.
Thank you so much, Sergei. Thank you so much to the Temerty family, not only for founding this program, but for being here with us tonight, and thanks to all our guests. I'm so excited to introduce the Contemporary Ukraine program. It's a new initiative at the Ukrainian Research Institute. Thank you to the Temerty Family Foundation for sponsoring this program. The goal of the program in general is to serve as a bridge between the scholarly and policy communities in order to promote a deeper understanding of Ukraine in the world. The primary contribution of this program will be an annual conference, which will begin in the spring of 2020. And that conference is going to deal with issues that are central to contemporary Ukraine. And that conference will also serve the program's goal of being a bridge between the scholarly and policy communities, as we anticipate inviting not just scholars, but also policy makers, policy writers, researchers, and hopefully journalists as well. In terms of our programming that we've already achieved this semester, we've had a few seminar speakers on contemporary Ukrainian topics. That's part of the Ukrainian Research Institute's seminar series. And then we also anticipate pursuing a research agenda, which will be related not only to the existing projects of the Ukrainian Research Institute, but we'll also be embarking on some new research, treating some particular issues of contemporary Ukraine, including the issue of internally displaced people, and of course paying attention to the possible paths to resolution of the conflict in the Donbass. And so in light of these programming and research goals, we are so thrilled to have our program opened by retired Ambassador John Taft, whose expertise and experience in the former Soviet Union are really unparalleled. So John Taft is a senior fellow at the RAND Corporation, and he served as ambassador to Ukraine from 2009 to 2013, in addition to also serving as ambassador to Russia from 2014 to 2017, in Georgia from 2005 to 2009, and Lithuania from 2000 and 2003. And this is on top of his 45-year career in the United States Foreign Service. So he's also held positions in Moscow as Deputy Chief of Mission from 1996 to 99. He served in Rome, Budapest, and Jerusalem as well. He originally retired from the Foreign Service in 2013 and worked as the Executive Director of the RAND Corporation's U.S.-Russia Business Leaders Forum until he was recalled to duty in 2014 to serve as the U.S. Ambassador to Russia. And he has several awards, including the Secretary of State's Distinguished Service Award, the State Department's Distinguished Honor Award. And he also has been married to Mariella Teft, who is also here with us today since 1971. They have 2 daughters and 2 granddaughters. And today, John Test is going to be speaking to us about U.S.-Ukrainian relations. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you very much, Emily. Microphone's working okay? Good. All right, good. Mr. and Mrs. Temerty, Sergey, distinguished guests, friends, it's really a pleasure for me to be here today. I'm grateful to Sergey Plokhy for this invitation. I'm a big fan of Dr. Plokhy and his work. I've learned a lot from his books on Ukraine and on the end of the Soviet Union. They've been helpful to me through the course of my career in understanding the history and implications of foreign policy issues, which we're frankly still wrestling with today. I want to first of all extend my congratulations to all of you who've had a part in setting up this new program, particularly Professor Plokhy, Mr. and Mrs. Temerty, Emily Chanel Justice and her team. My understanding is that this program is designed to serve as a platform for both academic and policy communities to exchange ideas on topics that include foreign policy, domestic government politics, as well as significant sociological and cultural trends. In me, you have before you a speaker who is a representative of the policy community. I'm not a scholar. I tell my friends that I'm a recovering diplomat. I spent 45 years in the Foreign Service, as Emily said, and my partner in that career, again, as Emily said, my wife Mariella is here with me tonight. She was with me at every step of the way through this career, representing our country and promoting our nation's interests. Before I get into the substance of my remarks, I want to begin with kind of a personal note. Obviously, Ukraine is very much in the news these days. As you all know, Ukraine and its president are caught up in a dispute which has now become a heated domestic fight here in the United States. I regret that this has all happened, but I want to be clear on one point. I'm not going to be able to talk today about our own domestic politics. I'm a senior fellow at RAND Corporation, as Emily said. RAND, as some of you probably know, is an organization which for nearly 75 years has provided our government and the American public straightforward, nonpartisan analysis of foreign affairs. RAND asks all of its employees not to engage publicly in discussion of partisan political issues, and that's the approach I'll take today. That said, I do want to emphasize that I do feel strongly about the mistreatment of our former ambassador to Ukraine, Masha Ivanovich, and have signed letters of support to her. One of my colleagues, John Herbst, one of my predecessors in Ukraine, is here with us tonight and has been a leader in this regard. I also worry about what this crisis in our country is doing to U.S. Foreign Service, to the State Department, and to our ability to use diplomacy to advance our national interests in a very dangerous world. I also fear that the domestic upheaval here at home over Ukraine will simply encourage Russia and reduce the leverage of the new Ukrainian government, the leverage that they will have just as they begin negotiations, tough negotiations with Russia to end the war in eastern Ukraine and the Donbas region. So I hope you'll understand that I'm going to try to focus today on the situation in Ukraine itself and the challenges it faces now and in the future. Let me start by going back to 1992. My first official encounter with Ukraine really came in the spring of that year. I was the deputy director of what was the Office of Soviet Union Affairs, but which after the Soviet Union went down the drain on Christmas Day of 1991, we renamed the Office of Independent States and Commonwealth Affairs. At that point, frankly, we didn't know what was going to happen in the former Soviet space, and so we tried to pick a fairly generic title for the office. In preparation for the visit of Ukrainian President Leonid Kravchuk on May the 6th, 1972, the first official visit to the United States, I think, by a president of independent Ukraine, our office was in charge of preparing documents for the signature of the two presidents, George H.W. Bush and Leonid Kravchuk, as well as other documents for signature by cabinet officials. I was asked to oversee this process for the U.S. side. A number of the documents were actually diplomatic agreements that we had signed with the Soviet Union, but which the Ukrainian government wanted to re-sign as bilateral agreements between the United States and Ukraine, with English and Ukrainian language versions both being equally valid. What this meant was that official translators were required to translate all these texts and make sure the two language versions corresponded with each other as precisely as possible. Well, this is actually lots harder than it sounds, because both English and Ukrainian have rich vocabularies, and finding the right words with the right connotations which would satisfy both sets of official translators was not an easy task. So the process went on into the night. At the beginning of the process, I was told that as the senior U.S. official president, I had to initial each page to certify that the translation was correct. My first reaction was to say, hey, wait a minute, I don't speak or read Ukrainian. And they said, relax, relax. The translators will do the work. Your signature is just pro forma. Well, what I remember most clearly is initialing dozens of pages of documents in the wee hours of the morning at the State Department. Everyone was exhausted. All I could think is people are going to make mistakes here. And I remember driving home that night exhausted, praying that these mistakes would never become a big problem in our bilateral relations. Because as you know, there's lots of cases where we do these translations of documents, and sometimes the words are so ambiguous that you have problems and policy squabbles later. Well, as far as I know, I'm looking at Professor Flohi, who's the expert, we've never had disputes over the wording of these documents, but my fingers still remain firmly crossed. That period was an enormously important one for setting the foundations of our relationship, a relationship we've had with Ukraine and the other independent states of the former Soviet Union. And I don't just mean signing these agreements. On September the 4th of 1991, not long after the failed coup against Gorbachev, Secretary of State Jim Baker held a press conference at the State Department, and he outlined what would become U.S. policy goals in this region as the Soviet Union collapsed and the new independent states came into being. Baker was clear that the United States would try in the post-Soviet world to build a good relationship with Russia, but would also make major efforts to create productive bilateral relationships with the new independent states of the former Soviet Union. So what we had was a two-pronged strategy designed to promote our strategic interests and our democratic values. At his press conference at the State Department that day, Baker articulated 5 basic principles that would guide U.S. policy. First was self-determination, consistent with democratic principles. Second, recognition of existing borders. Third, support for democracy and the rule of law. Fourth, preservation of human rights and the rights of national minorities. And fifth, respect for international law and legal obligations. I believe that these principles have broadly formed the basis of U.S. policy through successive American administrations, Democrat and Republican, over the past 28 years. They were certainly at the core of what my staff and I tried to do in Kyiv during my tenure as ambassador there, as well as during the period when I served as ambassador to Russia from 2014 to 2017. Mariella and I returned a month ago from a week in Kyiv, where we attended the Alta European Strategy Conference, or the YES Conference as it's known to some. In addition to listening to many speakers talk about the new Zelensky government, we were able to see many old friends, both business and personal, and to get a feel for the current situation. I should note that this was before the controversy blew up publicly over the telephone call between President Trump and President Zelensky. So I came away from Kyiv with a number of impressions, which I thought I would share with you tonight. First, you could really sense a palpable, get a sense of the palpable excitement in the Ukrainian capital, which was generated by the election of Volodymyr Zelensky and the new parliament. The Ukrainian people clearly voted in an overwhelming and an unprecedented manner for change. You'll recall that Zelensky won the presidential election with nearly 74% of the vote, a landslide of historic proportion. In July's parliamentary election, his party, Servant of the People, won 43.6% of the vote and took a majority of 254 seats in the 450-seat parliament. But I think those numbers, even those numbers, don't convey the enormity of the political change that has occurred in Ukraine this year. 80% of the members of the parliament have never served in the Rada before. 61% have never been involved in politics before. The average age of a parliament member today it dropped from 48% for 48 before to 41 today. The number of female members increased from 13 to 21%. The new Ukrainian cabinet of ministers also reflects this infusion of youth into the government. It's headed by 35-year-old lawyer Alexei Honcharuk. The average age of cabinet members today is 39, whereas Deutsche Welle, the German radio, reported recently 14 years younger on average than the current German cabinet member. I saw a number of these young ministers in the government speaking at the YES conference. The ones I saw were impressive in their presentations. They all seemed to recognize that their idealism would soon meet the reality of hard politics and actually governing the country. The youth of the ministers reminded me of the early Saakashvili governments in the Republic of Georgia when I served there as ambassador from 2005 to 2009. I have to tell you that the excitement about the possibilities of real change in Ukraine is, to be sure, tinged with a certain nervousness, even a cynicism born of the public's frustration over the past 3 decades. I think you'll remember the hopes that were generated back in 2005 when the Orange Revolution brought Viktor Yushchenko to the presidency. John Herbst was the ambassador in that period, a distinguished job he did. Those hopes were dashed following 5 years of internal government quarrels. As one of my Ukrainian friends told us in Kyiv on this trip, this is our 4th second chance. Will we succeed this time in building a real democracy? Can we create a nation and society built on the rule of law, eliminating the worst of the corruption which has plagued our country? And everybody said, we'll see. Those of you who follow Ukraine in the media know that there are some real fears about the continuing influence of some of the oligarchs in Ukraine. One of the reasons that political analysts give for the resounding defeat of former President Petro Poroshenko is that the Ukrainian people saw him as not delivering on his promises to attack corruption and to diminish the influence of the Ukrainian oligarchs. He promised reforms, but he often put them off once he was in office. Many people are waiting to see how Zelensky honors his campaign promise to eliminate corruption and to rein in the influence of the oligarchs. One of the first things the new parliament did was to vote overwhelmingly on September the 3rd, 2019, to remove parliamentary immunity for members of the Rada. In the past, immunity from prosecution protected corrupt members from being held accountable for their illegal deeds. Other reforms have passed or are pending before the parliament. Zelensky now also faces a tough decision regarding one particular Ukrainian oligarch, and that's Ihor Kolomoisky, who was one of his strong supporters in his run for president. You may recall that in the Poroshenko term, the Ukrainian National Bank nationalized Kolomoisky's Privatbank after it was discovered that there was, as the Financial Times reported, a, quote, $5.5 billion black hole in the balance sheet. The FT reported that, and I'm quoting, Ukraine launched legal proceedings against Mr. Kolomoisky and his partner Gennady Bogolubov, accusing them of running a Ponzi-like scheme to launder money and use the bank's retail deposit base to fund their own businesses. Kolomoisky now wants to be compensated for what he believes was an illegal step by the government to take his assets. The issue's in the courts, but it's also before the government. Prime Minister Honcharuk recently said that Zelensky wants to seek a compromise with Kolomoisky. The problem is that the IMF has said that any backsliding on the nationalization of the Privatbank will jeopardize its $3.9 billion standby program with Ukraine. Prime Minister Honcharuk responded that whatever solution to the problem will be found, it will be found with the agreement of the IMF. How he's going to balance this and figure this out is a good question. Maybe some of the other people here tonight will have a good answer, but clearly Ukraine cannot afford to jeopardize the IMF assistance that it receives right now. To complicate this issue, Kolomoisky's former lawyer, Andrei Bogdan, is now the chief of staff to President Zelensky. Many commentators see him as the second most powerful man in Ukraine. And there's a lot of speculation about his views and his power in the inner circle of advisors around Zelensky. He was frequently mentioned in the media as opposing Alexander Daniluk, who resigned a few weeks ago as Zelensky's national security advisor. Daniluk had earlier served as finance minister in the cabinet of Petro Poroshenko until he resigned from that government over policy difference. Now, when Daniluk joined Zelensky's team at the beginning, many of Ukraine's best Western friends in the business community and elsewhere were reassured that an experienced hand was now coming into the cabinet to help the new president deal with all of Ukraine's problems. His departure now, for unexplained reasons, has correspondingly raised questions about the course of the new president. Everyone I talk to in Kyiv wants the war in the Donbass to end. They want to see an end to the killing, but most of the people I talk to do not want to compromise the future of Ukraine. They do not want to compromise the independence of Ukraine. Most seem to be ready to cede substantial autonomy to Donetsk and Lugansk oblasts, but not to cede greater Russian influence inside of Ukraine. And I'll come back to this again in a few minutes. People also want economic reform from Zelensky's government. They want to see real growth in the economy, more jobs, a better standard of living. To give you an idea of how far Ukraine has fallen behind in the past 3 decades, compare its situation today with that of neighboring Poland. As the Kyiv Post reported, in 1991, these two large Central European countries had basically the same domestic product. Poland's was about 88.5 billion, according to the World Bank data, while Ukraine's GDP was at 77.5 billion. The 2017 figures show that Poland's annual GDP has now grown to 524 billion, while Ukraine's is at 112 billion. Moreover, Poland's average wages are now roughly 4 times larger than Ukraine. There are obviously other reasons besides poor economic performance at play here. One is the impact of the 2014 invasion of Crimea and the Russian incursion into the Donbass. But there's no question that Poland's resolute pursuit of real economic reform, indeed shock therapy, is responsible for the vast discrepancy we see between these two countries today. It's little wonder today that over 1 million Ukrainians, an estimate of 1 million Ukrainians, are working in Poland in both short and long-term jobs, and over 40,000 Ukrainian students are studying in Poland. Let me read a short part of the recent report of the IMF evaluation team that was in Kyiv to assess the current economic situation and the government's plans. Quote, "Growth is too low, however, to noticeably close the income gap with Ukraine's neighbors. Per capita GDP in Ukraine is still low, 20% of the EU average, the second lowest of all Central and East European countries. Growth is held back by a weak business environment, with shortcomings in the legal framework, pervasive corruption, and large parts of the economy dominated by inefficient state-owned enterprises or by oligarchs, deterring competition and investment." Now, Zelensky's team has outlined a very comprehensive list of reforms that they will pursue. Among the areas they're going to focus on are land reform, educational reform, judicial reform, military reform. It's a big list. Most of all, however, Zelensky's team understands that they need to boost growth in the country and address the causes, the problems that were outlined by the IMF in the statement I just read. September 30th, Prime Minister Hunčeruk's government released a very ambitious 5-year development plan. It has set development of human capital and the economy, defense, quality of life, European integration as the nation's priorities. Hunčeruk's policy, or his plan, promises to invest in science, education, and culture while seeking to create conditions for the delivery of quality and accessible services. In 5 years, the Prime Minister wants the economy to grow by 40%. To achieve this goal, he believes that gross domestic product should rise by 5% next year and increase by at least 7% per annum between 2021 and 2024. To ensure these growth rates, of course, Ukraine needs substantial investment. They estimate $50 billion of foreign investment over the next 5 years. So you can see the challenge that the government faces on the economic front. 3 final impressions from our trip to Kyiv. First, you get a strong sense everywhere you go of real national pride. The resentment against Russia for taking Crimea and starting the war in the Donbass is palpable. One of the most common lines you hear in Kyiv is that Vladimir Putin has succeeded in doing what no other Ukrainian politician has ever done. He has united the country. And to a certain extent, that is very much true. Second, reflecting the animosity toward Russia, there's been a strong growth in sentiment for Ukraine to join NATO and the European Union. Since the start of the war in Donbass in 2014, polls have shown pluralities and sometimes a clear majority in favor of joining both of those organizations. To give you some perspective, popular support for joining NATO remained relatively static at around 23 to 24% during my tenure as ambassador from 2009 to 2013. Most significantly, President Zelensky has expressed his support for joining both the EU and NATO, continuing the policy of his predecessor, Petro Poroshenko. Finally, I found on my visit to Kyiv that President Zelensky is every bit as good a speaker in person and on TV as I've been led to believe. He is a real natural on TV, reflecting his experience as an actor. I'm sure you all know that his portrayal in the television series Servant of the People, which you can see on Netflix for those of you who haven't seen it, he portrays a Ukrainian school teacher whose disgust with Ukrainian political corruption is filmed by a student, and this then is put out on social media, and it basically catapults him to become president of Ukraine. In one of the great examples of life imitating art, Zelensky ran then and won the presidential election overwhelmingly. And I think this year's election results speak for themselves about his ability to communicate with and influence the Ukrainian people's views on life in their country. I want to turn now in greater detail to the war in the Donbass. In many ways, it is the key issue which affects everything in Ukraine and in the society. It is, as I said before, an issue which is on the minds of everyone there. Everyone wants to see the war end, but they want to see it end on terms which Ukraine's independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity are preserved. Since Russia launched its incursion into the Donetsk and Lugansk regions of Ukraine in 2014, over 13,000 people have been killed. An estimated 30,000 have been injured, and an estimated 1.5 million people have been displaced. And for what purpose? To give Russia a permanent say in Ukrainian politics? To prevent Ukraine from leaving the Russian sphere of influence? To prevent Ukraine from joining NATO and the EU? Well, I think all of these are true, even though the Russian side has never clearly articulated these war aims. Moscow continues to maintain the fiction that they are only supporting the indigenous people in the Donetsk and Lugansk region who are seeking their legal rights. So talks to the end five-year conflict have been going on now for years. You'll remember that a framework for solving the problem was developed in Minsk in February 2015 after an all-night meeting in the Belarusian capital between Presidents Poroshenko and Putin, Chancellor Merkel, and then French President Francois Hollande. The so-called Minsk Accords were a loosely worded set of goals calling for withdrawals of forces, elections, and the eventual reestablishment of Ukrainian sovereignty over the region. The Normandy Group, as the four-nation group came to be called, is composed of these representatives from the four countries who have been meeting and negotiating now for years at different levels, along with representatives of the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. They're trying to work out an arrangement to implement the accords. And there are many who, frankly, that have grown frustrated and tired of this and who believe that the agreement is fundamentally unrealizable. However, no one wants to abandon the agreement because it is the only agreed negotiating framework on the table. Zelensky ran on a platform which emphasized ending the war in Donetsk and Lugansk. On Tuesday, October 1st, his representatives took the first step toward this goal by signing an agreement to move ahead with elections in the Donbass according to a formula which was originally conceived by former German Foreign Minister and now German President Frank-Walter Steinmeier. Negotiators from Ukraine, Russia, France, and Germany met in the Belarusian capital, and they agreed on a schedule under which the elections should be held. Now, as I mentioned before, these free elections are one of the key components of the Minsk Accords. If the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe monitors the elections and certifies them as free and fair, the Ukrainian parliament is then supposed to pass a new law granting the regions special autonomous status. The announcement of this elections agreement by the Zelensky government immediately set off political fireworks in Ukraine. The opposition attacked it as a sellout to Russia, and demonstrations were launched by nationalist demonstrators who took to the streets of Kyiv and other cities to protest, chanting "No capitulation." The key issue is, of course, one of security. How, Zelensky's critics argue, can you have a genuine free election in the Donbas region if Russia and not Ukraine controls the security? They argue that all Russian troops must be out of Ukrainian territory, and Ukraine must control the international border with Russia before the elections. Not surprisingly, the Russians don't agree with this. Many analysts believe that the Russians want to see an election where their proxies, who are now ruling there, will be able to win the elections and then run the government and, in effect, prolong Russian influence inside of Ukraine. A key related issue is whether Ukrainians from these regions who want to remain part of Ukraine and who have fled the region during the last 5 years can return and vote. If they can't, many analysts believe that today's population will likely vote for the Russians, the pro-Russian candidates. So Zelensky responded to the criticism that he received on October the 1st by saying that elections cannot be held if any Russian troops remain in the region. It will be important, I think, to see whether this security requirement is fulfilled. Zelensky also said that special status for the Donbas region will not include changes to Ukraine's constitution, which, among other things, lays out the national goals for attaining membership in the EU and NATO. Zelensky further promised that the special status legislation, which would give autonomy to these two regions within Ukraine, will be drafted by Parliament, and here I'm quoting, in close cooperation and consultation with society. No red lines will be crossed in the new law. That's why there will be no capitulation. Zelensky seems to have his fingers on the pulse of the Ukrainian electorate. In a recent article published in the Eurasian Geography and Economics journal, Professor Alexei Haran of Kyiv Mohyla University and several of his colleagues argue, and here I'm quoting again, contrary to Russia's expectations, military intervention into Ukraine only strengthened the Ukrainian civic nation. As a number of polls demonstrate, since 2014, there is a growing trend that the vast majority of Ukrainians, also in the government-controlled areas of Donbas, identify themselves first and foremost as Ukrainian citizens. Regional and local identity is not their primary choice anymore, and there are clear indicators of a strong civic identity that favors a unitary Ukraine. There is wide acceptance of a diplomatic solution to the conflict and readiness for some compromises, but the reintegration of the occupied territories should take place according to pre-war conditions without any federalization of Ukraine. Also, without establishing a stable security regime in Donbas, there's little support for an implementation of the political part of the Minsk agreements. Bloomberg reported that 53% of Ukrainians support the idea of elections in the east once the Ukraine regains control over the territories. So you can see Zelensky is going to have a tough task to achieve his goals in negotiations with the Russians, but also to maintain Ukrainian domestic support for his plan. The French and German governments, of course, welcomed the election agreement on October the 1st, but Zelensky's foreign minister, Vadim Prystaiko, also warned that Ukraine is not going to be pressured by France and Germany. Many people feel that they're so anxious to finish this negotiation and be done with this problem that they will push Ukraine very quickly forward. The next step in the process is likely to be a summit meeting in the Normandy format with President Zelensky, President Putin, President Macron, and Chancellor Merkel participating. Zelensky concluded on October 1st that, quote, today the final obstacles have been removed to holding the summit of the Normandy 4. We'll know the date of that in the very future. On October 14th, Foreign Minister Prystaiko said they were focusing on a meeting in mid-November. One thing seems clear. Winning the presidential election was one thing, but negotiating with Vladimir Putin is going to be quite another. Zelensky will have his work cut out for him. Moreover, while Zelensky has substantial support at home, he will also face tough opposition in forging a negotiating line which can have a chance to achieve public support for any deal he proposes and hopefully reaches with the Russians. So let me now turn to Ukraine's relationship with Russia. Ukraine's ties with Russia have been severely curtailed since the invasion of Crimea and the Russian incursion into the Donbass. Contacts have been cut, visas have been denied, sanctions have been imposed by both sides. And so what is at the root of this Russian behavior? I believe that Russian policy reflects a fundamental rejection by Vladimir Putin and many in the Russian political and security elite of Ukraine's independence. You'll remember the famous private Putin comment to President George W. Bush at a dinner after the 2008 NATO summit in Bucharest. Somebody left a microphone on, and Putin was overheard saying the following to George Bush. "You don't understand, George. Ukraine's not even a state. What is Ukraine? Part of its territory is Eastern Europe, but the greater part is a gift from us." In the first part, Putin clearly was referring to the western regions of Ukraine, which at various points in history were controlled by Lithuania, Poland, and Austria. In the second part, he was referring to Khrushchev's famous decision on February the 19th, 1954, to transfer the Crimean Oblast from the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic to the Ukrainian SSSR. Putin's candid comment to Bush was picked up by a microphone, as I said, at the head table. He subsequently, however, has spoken many times and stated that the people of Russia and the Ukraine are one people. He's tried to characterize Ukrainian nationalism as reflective of only a small part of the population. In my view, it now animates the majority of the people inside the country. Some of my colleagues at the RAND Corporation wrote a paper back in 2015 after the start of the war in the Donbass. And they tried to characterize in 4 key findings what Russian policy was. They said, first, Russia has traditionally sought buffer states on its border, and Ukraine is a key buffer. Second, Russians historically have tended to view Ukraine as fundamentally Russian by culture and background. Third, Russia seeks a great power role and influence and perceives itself as being in competition with the United States. And fourth, long-standing beliefs about Russia's rights within this region are exacerbated by a consistent post-Soviet view that Western efforts to support Ukraine and other countries in this region are in fact a mechanism for controlling and weakening Russia itself. So Russian policy, frankly, didn't have to be this way. There was a choice to be had if they wished. There are some Russian analysts who have actually taken issue with the Kremlin's policy in Ukraine. In March 2018, for example, Dmitry Trenin, the director of Moscow's Carnegie Center, wrote a thought-provoking article entitled "Russia and Ukraine, From Brothers to Neighbors." Since the start, he wrote, and this is a quote, "Since the start of the conflict in Donbass, the formation of the Ukrainian political nation has proceeded on a clear anti-Russian platform. It did not have to be had Russia's foreign policy been more enlightened. The emergence of independent Ukraine, as well as Belarus, is a natural process, something that Russia would be better off understanding and accepting as a fact. As independent nations, Ukraine overtly and Belarus less so, are tilting toward the European Union for the same reasons as Romanians and Bulgarians. A clever Russian policy should have seen that and offered them a concept of how to, quote, go west without breaking with Russia. This is too late for Ukraine, but it can still be done in Belarus." Professor Plokhy is the real expert on Russia-Ukrainian relationships, so I'm not going much further on this into this field. But let me just make 2 final points. When Mariella and I arrived to serve at the U.S. Embassy in Moscow in September of 2017, I frequently found myself in private conversations with Russian officials and ordinary citizens, where I had to constantly rebut erroneous Russian characterizations of Ukraine. Whether it was their historical perception, which had not changed, or whether they had simply swallowed the Kremlin propaganda line, many official and unofficial Russians showed a striking lack of familiarity with the modern Ukraine that I knew, having served there only a year before, in Ukraine only a before. As time's gone by, I think many Russian people privately have come to see the situation in a more realistic way. Many Russians have Ukrainian family connections, and they heard from their relatives in Ukraine or they've gone to visit them. I remember hearing more than once from Russian friends that the only issue which was not discussed at their Sunday family dinners was Ukraine, because differences of opinion frequently would lead inevitably to arguments, fights, and destroy the entire atmosphere of what was supposed to be a friendly family event. Many Russians were also surprised that the Ukrainian armed forces fought back so hard and that there was such a strong reaction against Russia among so many in Ukraine. There was an assumption that all Russian-speaking Ukrainians had a natural affinity for Russia. This isn't true. I remember one of my Ukrainian employees at the U.S. Embassy in Kyiv who was raised in Novosibirsk, Russia, because his father had a job there. He frankly didn't speak Ukrainian very well at all. Russian was his first language, but he was one of the most patriotic Ukrainians I ever met. He regularly would take time off, take his vacation time, and go participate in demonstrations against Russian influence in the country. Finally, let me return for a few minutes to U.S.-Ukrainian relations, which I discussed earlier, talking about Jim Baker and the basis for U.S. policy. I believe that the principles followed by the administration of George H.W. Bush have broadly served as a guide for every U.S. administration since then. And I will concede that there is some confusion today about the approach of the Trump administration, but I think we still have the broad bipartisan support in the Congress and among foreign policy experts that Ukraine should be independent, and that is still widely held. U.S.-Ukraine relations have been generally warm and positive over 3 decades, strongly supported by an energetic and politically active Ukrainian-American community. But we have, as most of you know, had our ups and downs. We've had controversy with the Kuchma administration over selling the famous cold sugar radar system to Iraq. We've disagreed with Ukrainian support for the building of the Bushehr nuclear reactor in Iran. And we've had differences over the pro-Nazi past of some of the Ukrainian nationalist organizations. We've also expressed strong concerns over the murder of journalist Georgi Gonzadze and clearly opposed the Yanukovych government because of its human rights and political abuses. Throughout this history, notwithstanding our differences, I think we've generally stayed dedicated to helping Ukraine defend its independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity, and our support to help them build a more modern, democratic, free market society with rule of law at its base. It is still a work in progress. For a good survey of this relationship, I urge you to read the book, The Eagle and the Trident, U.S.-Ukraine Relations in Turbulent Times by Steve Pfeiffer, who is also an ambassador in Ukraine and a good friend of both John and mine. A key part of our support for Ukraine has, of course, always been our heavy investment in the country through a robust foreign assistance package. John Herbst himself, I thought, neatly summarized this approach when he said, "Our efforts have been designed to promote stability, to protect the integrity and sovereignty of Ukraine, and help it reform. We've spent large sums of money under the Nunn-Lugar program, helping Ukraine remove nuclear weapons and rid themselves of highly enriched uranium left over from the Soviet period. With USAID programs, we've helped Ukraine fight tuberculosis and HIV/AIDS. We've helped them reform their economy, battle corruption, improve their agricultural system, educate their young people, and build a strong civil society with effective non-governmental organizations. We've sold Javelin anti-tank weapons and other defensive arms to Ukraine. We've helped train Ukrainian troops. And this year, the Defense Department is spending $250 million in Ukraine for additional military training equipment and advisory efforts to build the capacity of their armed forces. The U.S. State Department is separately planning to provide $141 million in aid. I'm particularly proud of the work of various U.S. agencies over the years to help build Ukrainian civil society. My own view is that our work with civil society there and also in Georgia has been some of the most successful that we've done in this part of the world. Many experts will cite the positive impact of civil society in Ukraine over the years. In addition, many members of the new government in Kyiv and the society have, of course, U.S. educational connections. So let me bring my presentation to a close by quoting from statements by 2 experts on the region. The first was made by the late Dr. Zbigniew Brzezinski to the Senate Foreign Relations Committee on January the 15th, 2014, a month or so before Russia invaded Ukraine. In his statement that day entitled Implications of the Crisis in Ukraine, the scholar and former National Security Advisor said the following, and I quote, "My own general message is simple. A democratic, sovereign, and European Ukraine is what the Ukrainian people want and deserve. Such a Ukraine will encourage Russia to become an important post-imperial partner of the West as a whole, and that's a very important strategic point. Hence, support for Ukrainian aspirations is not political warfare against Russia, but is in fact favoring Russia's long-term interests. And we have to keep that in mind, that larger framework. A Eurasian Union, such as the one that Putin aspires to create, which is held together by pressure and motivated by nostalgia, is not a long-term solution for Russia's own socioeconomic and geopolitical dilemmas. Sooner or later, the current authoritarianism driven by imperial ambitions in Russia will fail." Well, as I said, 1 month after he wrote those words, Russian troops invaded Crimea and fomented an insurrection in the Donbass. I'm sure that Zvig was not surprised. Empires don't always die quickly, and imperialists often hang on to their views long after the political and economic situations have begun to change. Certainly the situation in Ukraine vis-a-vis Russia has changed dramatically in recent years, and I agree with Brzezinski that building democracy in Ukraine and setting an example for Russia will eventually help change the situation in Russia itself. My second quote is from Arkady Ostrovsky, the Russia editor of The Economist, who wrote the following in his superb book, The Invention of Russia, From Gorbachev's Freedom to Putin's War. And I'm quoting, "Putin has portrayed himself as a gatherer of Russian lands and a restorer of the Russian Empire. In fact, he is likely to go down in history as its grave digger. His deputy chief of staff once suggested that Putin was Russia. No Putin, no Russia, he said, with arrogant simplicity. It is hard to think of a worse indictment. Putin offered war as an alternative to modernity and the future. The forces he awakened are the forces not of imperial expansion. Russia does not possess the energy or vision required for empire building, but of revisionism, chaos, and war. He may plunge the country into darkness, or Russia may yet rid itself of this post-imperial syndrome and emerge as a nation state." I think Arkady's probably right. It is difficult to know what will happen when the Putin era comes to an end, or what Russia's long-term future will be. It could plunge into chaos, or it could become a more modern nation. Moreover, Putinism may not end overnight, and Russia will undoubtedly remain dangerous during any transition. But I suspect that objective factors, as the old communists used to say, will eventually force change. And it's my hope that Russian leaders will eventually come to realize that Ukraine is an independent country and that they will learn to work cooperatively together. The United States has a big stake in that process in supporting real change in both countries. And it's my firm hope the Temerty Contemporary Ukraine program here at the Harvard Ukrainian Research Institute will be a major contributor to promoting a better current understanding of the stakes for the United States in Ukraine, as well as the education of the next generation of American scholars and policymakers specializing in Central and Eastern Europe. We will need the best people we have to help the United States understand and work with Ukraine and other nations in this region for what I consider to be vital American national interests. I thank you very much for listening, and I'll be happy now to answer your questions or to discuss any of the points that I've made. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Teff, for your insights. I'm sure that there's a lot of questions. I have a microphone, so if you could please let me know your question.
Thank you very much for your remarks. Stimulating, but I was very concerned throughout your whole remarks. You mentioned, simply en passant, Crimea.
Mm-hmm.
Listening to your talk or remarks, it sounded as if Crimea no longer exists or exists only as part of Russia, that your primary concern, and now the concern of the government of Ukraine, let alone foreign interests, even ostensibly in help of Ukraine, is with Eastern Ukraine. The implication being the Crimea is gone. Lip service may be paid to it, but it's no longer of interest because it's quote unquote never coming back. And in many ways, your remarks were a reflection of that. With regard to then the matter of Eastern Ukraine and the proposed revivification of the Minsk discussions, I would ask a theoretical question. Does it not make sense that on the eve of these negotiations, the Ukrainian military step up its military activity, cross the given line, take as much territory as possible, and then, even while those negotiations are going on, which is standard practice in many countries, as you know, and then we can sit down and have a talk with Moscow. You know, we all know, the Russians only understand one thing. And this has nothing to do with Putin. This has to do with the entire gamut of Russian history, force and power. Really what the underlying proposal here is, once again, let's stay where we are and depend upon negotiations with Western powers. It's that faith that Ukraine and Central European countries have placed in the Western powers, including the United States, after World War I, on the eve of World War II. But they've been betrayed, literally. Why should any government, including a Ukrainian government, have faith in the potential support that they may have from Western powers, whether they are the United States, whether they are the European Union, etc.? Yes, play with them, get as much advantages as you can, but you have to show your force on the ground.
On your first point, I'm sorry if I didn't stress it enough. I thought I said uphold the territorial integrity, sovereignty, and independence over and over again. I think the reality is that Vladimir Putin is not going to negotiate anything on Crimea. And so the pragmatic decision that was made by Western governments was we will focus on trying to get the Donbass and get the Russians out of there. And that's why you've seen this over the last 5 years. I will tell you, when I was ambassador in Moscow, I used to get these constant questions from American press and others about, hey, have you guys all given up on Crimea? And my answer to them was no, we didn't, and we won't. And I used to say to them, and this is before the Trump administration came in and made this a matter of policy, I said, we're never going to recognize this forcible incorporation, just as we never supported the forced incorporation of the Baltic countries. And I knew that because I was ambassador in Lithuania. And I used to say this bluntly, publicly, privately there, and I meant it. And then the Trump administration, I think in the first year, came out with a very clear statement to that effect. The practical matter is to try to get some of them, get the Russians out of the Donbass. Now, the question of force is of course a legitimate question, but I think the Ukrainians, if you're looking at this from Zelensky's standpoint, he has to calculate that the Europeans and the United States are not going to come to his rescue militarily to fight. And I mean, this has been one of the realities that, I faced this in Georgia, I faced it in Ukraine. We're not going to send American soldiers there. I mean, we can all see what's happening today in America. We're pulling out a few thousand troops out of Syria. And, my own sense, and my wife's family lives out in Kansas. These people don't want any more American troops overseas. Now, I think we need to stay. I would have stayed in Syria, but I think supporting Ukraine's military as we have is the right thing to do. But going in and trying to force this could end up with a situation where Putin, not wanting to be perceived as a loser because he sees this as his legacy, the tough guy, would try to counteract that with overwhelming force. And we know that they have aircraft and other things that can pulverize Ukraine. So I would be very reluctant to get out there and try to encourage Ukraine to try to use military force as a negotiating tactic or anything else. I think we got to let the current government give it a shot maybe that's not a good choice of words. I think we have to let them give it a chance to do the negotiation. And I certainly hope that the Germans and the French will support them. Now, the one thing I didn't go into a lot here was the whole question of Ukraine, of the United States becoming part of this negotiating framework. And Kurt Volker, our former Ukraine representative, said the U.S. was prepared to do that if it was asked to do it, but nobody's asked us to do that as yet. So, both legitimate points that you raised, but I don't think the Crimea is going to go away anytime soon. I think the Trump administration has kind of codified this position, and I think that's what it'll stay. But I also don't think we're going to go to be ready to support any kind of Ukrainian incursion or an attempt to try to carve off parts of the Donbass as a negotiating tactic or otherwise. Just the reality, I think, that we face. I answered all the questions. Okay.
I'm a historian by training, so my question refers to the earlier part of your service in Ukraine, and that is, you came to Kiev in December 2009, I believe. It was just before the second or third second chance that Ukraine faced, and that is the presidential election of 2010, which actually is the source of many of the difficulties that we see going on right now. I'm curious, what was your assessment when you came of the election campaign as it was developing and how it was carried out? And specifically, there is a view, which I to some extent share, that there were actually three candidates in that election. The third, apart from the two with carrying human names, was none of the above. And I'm wondering whether you and the embassy had a sense of to what extent this particular campaign figured in the ultimate results.
My recollection, I was planning to retire, frankly, after I finished in Georgia. And I was asked if I would go back to Ukraine and succeed Bill Taylor, who succeeded John Herbst as the ambassador there. And I think they asked me to do this because there was a broad expectation in Washington that Yanukovych could very well win this, because the polls showed him beating Tymoshenko, because Tymoshenko was so, what's the right word, discredited with all of her fights with Yushchenko, and what many people in Ukraine felt was kind of compromising and undercutting the whole purpose of the Orange Revolution. I'm being very blunt now. That said, we went out there with the very clear intent to monitor this as closely as we could. And we monitored and my predecessors my predecessor and his team had monitored this before. And I think if I remember correctly, Yanukovych led almost all the way leading up to this election against Tymoshenko. And then when the election took place, we relied on the monitors, the OSCE monitors, and all of the monitors that were sent out by our own International Republican Institute and National Democratic Institute, reporting from all around the country, and in the election headquarters, who confirmed that it was in fact basically a free and fair election, and that Yanukovych won. And that didn't make a lot of people very happy, because I think we all understood that the calculation was, if you try to block the will of the people in this case, how are you going to be able to enforce democracy the next time when it's going the other way? You have to respect the view of the people. You know, we've had other cases in American history where, or in recent history, I'm thinking of Gaza in particular, where was it Hamas won elections by what most people thought were free and fair. I mean, we hate Hamas. They're a terrorist organization, and yet the people in Gaza, for a lot of different reasons, voted to support them. Now, with regard to the last part of your question, I don't think none of the above, at least my recollection, was ever that big a force inside the country. There's a lot of people who didn't go to vote, so I suppose you can count them as that group. But I think all of the people we talked to at the embassy, Ukrainians and international people, were satisfied, however frustrating they found it, that the election results were achieved fairly and that the guy who got the most votes won. Now, sadly for Ukraine, that was Viktor Yanukovych, and we all know what happened to him eventually. But I don't know, John is an expert on this too. Is there anything else I've missed on this? That's certainly certainly the impression that I had about what was going on. And I tell you, we worked night and day to monitor what was going on, to get out everywhere in the country to be able to see what was going on so that we could give Washington our best, fairest assessment of what was happening in the campaign, what happened on election day, and then the counting of the votes. Sorry, that may not be what you want to hear, but that's what it is.
No, I didn't have an expectation.
Yeah, okay. Sir.
With understandable respect to the RAND Corporation limitations, from an institutional perspective, can you talk a little bit about the White House versus the State Department in foreign policy?
No, I'm not going to get into the Trump administration. I said, and I picked these words carefully, Masha Yovanovitch is a good friend of mine. She's a colleague of mine. And I think she did a tremendous job in what I understood was her testimony, at least as it was reported in the press. It was certainly consistent with what she did. And I said also that I wish this whole thing hadn't happened, because I don't think it's necessary. It hasn't helped our country, but it also hasn't helped Ukraine. And it's made it more difficult. Now, the last thing I read from Kyiv was that this hasn't affected much the popular opinion toward Mr. Zelensky. What affected popular opinion is what I talked about, which was the demonstrations against his agreeing with the Russians to have these fair elections. And I think what I saw was that he's lost 6 to 10 points or something. So he's gone from 74 or something to 66. So, lots of presidents would love to have 66% support. But I think it's there. I also feel badly, and I worry about what's happening to the State Department and to the Foreign Service. The flip side of that, if there is a silver lining, is that what you're seeing, and I suspect you're going to see it again tomorrow from Bill Taylor, who is not a Foreign Service officer, but a civil service officer, civil servant who has had a number of foreign overseas assignments. You're going to see the same kind of thing. These are people of honor, integrity, and courage who are speaking up, did speak up at critical times, and are now speaking up to lay out for the Congress and the American people what they really believe. And I'm proud of them for that. Okay? That's as far as I'm going to go today. I hope you understand. I mean, RAND treasures its nonpartisan, so I go along with the thing. But we all have our own personal views too. Sir?
Thank you. How important is whether or not Ukraine were to join NATO or a stronger military alliance with the West to the behavior of the Putin government? What's your view about that? And is there a way to respect an independent and sovereign Ukraine without necessarily insisting on full freedom to move toward a stronger military alliance with the West?
Yeah. Putin has made it abundantly clear that NATO membership is a red line. And you'll remember at the Bucharest summit in 2008, there was a huge debate, and the Germans, in effect, blocked, I guess supported by the French, any decision to bring NATO and Georgia into the alliance. And so they came up with a formulation which stated that at one point NATO, Ukraine and Georgia will become a part of the alliance. As a compromise to kind of preserve the long-term expectation, even while it did not move forward, to to give Georgia or Ukraine what's called the Membership Action Plan at that time. I think my own sense is that what's happened since then in Europe has resulted in the fact that we're not moving forward anytime soon on NATO membership. Even when I was ambassador from 2009 to 2013, we had lots of training programs and other things with the Ukrainian armed forces. They had very bad leadership, corrupt leadership. But we did bring in troops to train regularly. And that's now increased substantially, as well as providing defensive weapons like the Javelin anti-tank system, which is actually a very significant weapon, especially if someone was to try to come down the road of a tank. It's one of these fire and forget systems that are one of the best in the world. And we've done that as well as other things. There's fire suppression radars. There's a lot of things we have given to the Ukrainians or sold to the Ukrainians, which I think has helped them defend their country, to prevent this from getting out of hand. And frankly, there were times in Moscow when I was told that Putin and company were within a hair's breadth of launching an even bigger invasion. Now that may have just been, the usual propaganda, but I think at the beginning certainly there was a lot of fear about that because they were operating under this assumption that all of these people in Crimea and the Donbass were all very pro-Russian, which isn't the truth. You can go back and look at the International Republican Institute polls back when I was ambassador, 2010-11, and they show close to 60%, if I remember correctly, of the people in Crimea didn't want to be a part of Russia. They wanted to remain an autonomous region inside of Ukraine. And I think that's certainly where the popular opinion was then. But even in that period, there were only, as I said before, 24% of the people who actually supported NATO membership. And one of the criteria that we've always used as a basis for getting membership is you've got to have, your public's got to support getting into this. It can't just be a decision by the elite politicians, however smart it might be or however much we might agree with it. But it's only really since the Russians invaded in 2014 that you really see the substantial increase to, as I said, pluralities, if not a majority of the people favoring this. But our guys are doing a lot of training there now, and I think the quality of the armed forces has increased substantially and has improved substantially. That said, I wouldn't want a situation where Russia could unleash just on military power, especially aircraft, because the Ukrainians don't have the kind of aircraft that could combat these high-performance Russian aircraft that could do huge damage to different parts of Ukraine. So I don't see any prospect in the short term, from everything I know anyway. I'm out of government. I don't have access to all the information I used to, but I don't see the things moving forward anytime soon. That said, we got to keep working on building defense and building support, building a democratic society, because remember that's also been one of the criteria that NATO has used and EU has used to actually move forward on membership. And that's why I talked so much today about the economy and domestic politics, because that's equally important for Ukraine if they're going to be able to not only build their own modern nation, but to really be a part of the Western community. Yes, sir. Mr. Temerty.
I was going to ask a question.
Sorry. Where's the microphone? Oh, back, you're in the back. Okay, go ahead. Sorry.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador, for taking my question. Given that force is not an attractive option in resolving the dispute between Western Ukraine and the Donbass and Luhansk regions, what would you believe, in your view, is the strongest asset that Mr. Zelensky has for negotiating Russian withdrawal from contested territory? And also, given that Mr. Zelensky is a person of integrity, it seemed like you're relating to us, how far has he gotten in the battle against corruption, and would you advance an opinion on how far you think he will get on that subject?
Let me start with the second. I think he's just started on corruption, and there's a lot of people in this room who know Ukraine very well, and I think none of us would ever underestimate the power of corruption in that society. And I could have gone a lot more depth on the corruption in the courts and the the police and the rest of it. It's a huge effort to be undertaken, and it's going to take a lot of steps, and it's going to take time before it actually comes to fruition. But you got to start, and I mean, Poroshenko promised people, but he didn't do much. He pulled back on critical pieces. And they've just arrested or brought in for questioning one of Poroshenko's closest advisors for corruption, or on suspicion of corruption. So I think, I think they got to keep working at it. We need to continue to support that effort. First part again?
First part was, what do you think Mr. Zelensky's greatest asset is in negotiating some sort of agreement or withdrawal of Russia from
I think, I don't know, I came away from watching him, understand he doesn't have much experience, but he's one smart cookie. And I think he's so articulate at things. You meet people who are, you can just tell there's candle power up there, even if you can't. Yeah, he's just a really smart guy, and you see it in the way he handles himself. His English isn't great. It's okay, it's good, but you can see him struggling. You've probably seen these pictures with him sitting with President Trump. He's listening so intently because he doesn't want to miss anything. And he's got an interpreter, and at least one film clip I saw, he has to turn to get a translation for the right word he wants to use in English. Listen, I understand. I've tried to learn a lot of languages in the Foreign Service, and I've been in those moments lots more times than Mr. Zelensky has. But I think a lot of this is going to come down to maintaining the support of the West, which is, as I say, why I'm a little worried about what's going on now, because I think now's the time for us to do everything we can to support Zelensky. And I certainly hope the French and the Germans are not so fatigued by the long negotiations. You gotta stay firm with Putin. That's what he likes to do, outlast you. The Minsk Accords were reached after an all-night session. Classic Russian style, classic Putin style. And Zelensky's going to have to be equal to the task. He's going to have to be up to this if he's going to try to do it. And he's going to have good ideas. One of the things I know they were talking about when we were in Ukraine was doing more to build bridges. You may have seen this, a film clip. There's a bridge in the Luhansk region which they rebuilt, which had been destroyed in the fighting. And this allowed people to go back and forth, because people in Lugansk and Donetsk have to come over to get their Ukrainian pension checks. And people go back and forth, families and stuff. And they did that, and there was at least some indication they were going to try to do more of that kind of people-to-people kind of thing, to kind of, they didn't put it this way, but to kind of break down the psychological barriers as much as the physical barriers.
So, Ambassador Teff, thank you for your remarks, and thank you to Professor Maguchi as well for his spirited defense of Ukrainian sovereignty. I just wanted to make a comment that it's not a question, it's just a point of view that I think I'm allowed to do as someone who was born in the Donbass. I seem to disagree with both of you about Donetsk and Luhansk. Ambassador Teff seems to acquiesce to the idea that Zelensky should negotiate some kind of way to reincorporate that part of the Donbass into Ukraine. And Professor Maguchi says, well, we should maybe show some force to cause that to happen in under favorable terms for Ukraine. I think we should never take Donetsk and Luhansk back. It's hard enough to build a country, an economy, when you have unity. It's very difficult when you have several million people in that part of Ukraine who will constantly be at odds with you. It'll drain a tremendous amount of political effort. It will occupy so much mental space. I told President Poroshenko my view, and when I met with Zelensky, I said, Zelensky, I come from Donbass, and I don't want to see that part of Ukraine back. look, it's only 7% of the whole territory of Ukraine. That includes Crimea, and it's still the biggest country in continental Europe. So let the country thrive, let it survive, and it can do better without.
Leave them to the Russians?
You know, a multi-decade Transnistria would work for me.
You're obviously entitled to your view. I guess what I would say in response, Mr. Temperley, is that I was in Donetsk in April of 2013, a year before actually less than a year before the troops went in, the Russian troops. And I was in Lugansk in June. And when I was in Donetsk, I spoke at 3 different universities. And these are mainly young people at different faculties, at different parts, different universities. And I remember thinking just how smart these kids were. And, you know, I did university speeches everywhere I went in Ukraine, just like John and other ambassadors have done. Reach out to the young people of the country. And I came away thinking, God, these kids are so good at computers. I mean, but they asked really smart and sophisticated questions. Now, I don't know how many of those kids are still there. They may have all bailed out. Some may have gone to Russia. I think a lot of them probably are in Kyiv or another Kharkiv or someplace where there's a university that they've gone to. But I guess what I say to you in response is there's the issue of territorial sovereignty and maintaining Ukraine as we knew it, but there's also those people there, and I'm just not sure I want to leave them. I would want, and I realize this is an emotional message, not necessarily an intellectual response, but I'm not sure I would want to leave these people to the mercy of not just Russia, but some of these cutthroats who run the Russian policy down in the occupied Donbass. As one of my friends said, these are not nice men. So I don't know. That's all I can say in response. This is going to be decided by the Ukrainian people, obviously.
My question will build up on the previous one. I would like to ask you, are there any international discussions or plans of US government looking for a plan B? Recently, with this new Steinmeier formula, a lot of questions towards Ukrainian government was, imagine we have Donbass back, what will happen, what is the plan of reintegration? And of course the question would be, taking the extreme deep crisis, economic and also ecological, which has not been even assessed and discussed, and human resources loss as well, because as a sociologist, I conduct interviews with IDPs from Donbass beginning in 2014 until now, and majority of them state that they are not planning to come back, even
Donetsk or Lugansk?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, because they have already their new lives in new locations. So are there any plans, discussions, assessments, how and what would be the plan B if?
Yeah. One, I'm not in the government anymore. I haven't been in for 2 years. 2, I have not heard of any plan B. I'm looking at my friend John Herbst to see if he knows of one, but I don't. Both of us have spent time talking to Kurt Volker, who until recently was the main guy, as you know, working with Ukraine and with Russia and Germany and France to try to help foment these negotiations. I've never heard of a plan B at this point. There's been talk, I know, in the US government that should the United States try to join the Normandy group as a negotiator, but I'm not sure that there's another, and there's a lot of people in and out of government who criticize the Minsk Accords and talk about how we should have done it differently, but I just don't think it's going to go there, and especially given the political turmoil in Washington, I suspect at the State Department and at the NSC there's not a lot of discussion at this point when you talk about Ukraine about a plan B. Sorry.
Mr. Ambassador, thank you a lot for your reflection on the US-Ukraine relationships. Let me introduce myself. I'm Ilya Malerchuk, US Department of State, a professional fellow here. And I wanted to...
So you should have spoken then.
Return to the issue of NATO membership, which was already asked. that your argument was that people need to support also NATO accession of Ukraine to Ukraine NATO accession also, and economical development, democracy development.
What I said was that those are criteria which we and all of NATO have used for the previous two enlargements. I was ambassador in Lithuania, and so I used to constantly tell the Lithuanians, who actually were quite good, they had like 70% support for NATO, but also make sure you do these things democratically and then build your armed forces. The bigger problem was some of the other countries who joined.
Yes, and this question is a very big issue, red line for Russia, NATO integration of Ukraine. And since 2014, Ukraine population support of NATO integration grow, and Ukraine even enshrined its aspiration to NATO and EU integration in constitution. And this support is growing all the time. Democratic institutions are also developing. Civil society is strong enough and becomes stronger from day to day. And Ukraine aspires to have membership in NATO. The issue I see is that for Russia it's a red line, and it's a big concern for all international community. What would be your advice? How Ukraine could receive this membership in the near future? And second question would be, I would like to return to past, taking into account your service in Georgia as ambassador as well. I would be really grateful to hear your reflection regarding Russia-Georgian war, Russia aggression against Georgia, if it contributed to aggression against Ukraine, and the lack of strong international reaction to this war contributed to aggression to Ukraine, and what would be lessons learned from those two aggressions to Georgia and Ukraine for international community, as we are very globalized, and war in Ukraine or war in Georgia affects everybody.
Okay, excellent questions. I think we'll be here till about midnight if I try to go into all of them. Let me try to do it briefly. The first question on NATO, I'm in favor of Ukraine and Georgia being in NATO, but obviously there are some very significant people in Europe who are not, who are not ready to move, who weren't ready to move in 2008, and I think are even less inclined to do it right now. And that's unfortunate. So, we could send you to Berlin next week to make the argument there. I'm being silly, but, I think that's where some of the real problem is, because they just do not want to offend the Russians. Now, Putin has this idea that somehow if you control territory like Donetsk and Lugansk, that NATO will not expand into a country that has foreign occupation. He forgets that Germany did become a member of NATO even when the eastern chunk of the country was controlled by the Soviet Union. So I think that argument falls down. But I think it plays to some of these people in Europe who don't really want to see any more expansion, not just of NATO, but of the EU. Because they take this and they say, well, see, the Russians, we can't do this. They use the argument as an excuse for their own inaction, in other words. And I think that's a reality that exists. The Trump administration is on record as supporting, NATO membership, but given the current turmoil in Washington, I think I'm not sure exactly where everything stands at the White House and the NSC. The second issue is something, I'm actually writing a memoir at this point of my career, and there's going to be several chapters just on that question. At the time, in 2008, in August, when the war took place, our embassy in Tbilisi had been sending reports regularly to Washington, and you can see some of this stuff because it was all put out at WikiLeaks. As my Georgian friends say, oh yeah, we thought you did a good job there. But we were quite clear about that. And there's a very famous exchange of cables at the end of the war when our colleagues at the embassy in Moscow sent in a cable that this all got released into WikiLeaks too. Basically saying, don't give those Georgians any weapons because we want to build this new relationship with Russia. Medvedev is taken over as president. And we went back with a very carefully, and I thought cogently argued cable, saying, no, we need to defend. Help Georgia defend itself. We're not talking about sending American troops in. We've got trainers and we'll do that. There was a lot of what we were doing today with Ukraine. And we should consider giving them these defensive weapons, these anti-tank systems. I think more broadly, it's clear in hindsight that a lot of people underestimated Mr. Putin and what his long-term plans were. My own view is 2007, he gave this very famous speech in Munich at the Werkunde conference, which he put aside his prepared remarks and then blasted the United States up and down and Europe up and down, and everybody was shocked by this. Well, then the next year they invaded Georgia. And then, Medvedev's in charge, or is the president, he's not in charge, we know who was in charge. But, things kind of drifted until Putin came back in his third term in 2012. And then we all know what happened in 2014. I'm not sure it was a deliberate effort to necessarily go and invade these countries, but, I know that the plan to take Crimea was in the planning stage long before that. I remember when I was in Moscow in 1996 and 97, Mayor Grushkov used to go down to Simferopol and Sevastopol and give these nationalistic speeches, we will get our land back. And, at that time Yeltsin and company didn't, go along with this or support it. But, he was tapping into this Russian nationalism, which Putin has used since then. So they clearly are motivated, as I was trying to make clear in my remarks, by this kind of what I consider post-imperial. It's not neo-imperial, because I don't think they're going to succeed. That's why I gave you that quote at the end from Arkady Ostrovsky, who understands Russia acutely. I don't think they're going to be able to hold this empire, and part of the reason is their own economic weakness and problems that are there. But broader than that, I get letters all the time or notes, emails from graduate students saying, hey, will you give me your views on the war in Georgia? And my response, which is very kind and generous, says, I'm sorry, but I'm going to write a memoir and I'm keeping all the material for myself, and then you can read it there and you can use it in your study. I'm being a little silly, but I have some stuff that I want to say, and I'll get to it slowly but surely.
So we have time for just one more question.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. Your remarks were illuminating and well received. My name is Yeramo Volosenko. I'm a member of the Ukrainian diaspora. And my question really is about the other players here, and that's the Europeans. Mm-hmm. They really control this narrative moving forward. And we can have conversations about Ukraine and US attitude and so on, but it doesn't appear to me that they have any fear of any asynchronous activities in their part of the world. And what's your perception of that? I mean, they have a critical role to play here.
No, I think it's a good point. When I got to Moscow in September of 2014, the sanctions had been in place for like 4 or 5 months. And the whole focus at that point was, we could already see the Europeans trying to find ways to wiggle out of these. And they set it up so that they had to renew them every 6 months. Ours were a little different. Ours stayed until we did something negative, but they had to positively renew them. And for the first couple of years, when I was in Moscow, there was this constant debate, will the Europeans do this? And we spent a lot of diplomatic capital in the Obama administration saying, come on guys, Putin hasn't done a damn thing. Don't give in preemptorily here. We need to support this process, whether it's Minsk or otherwise. We need to support the Ukrainians. Because you remember, it wasn't just going into Ukraine. Putin tore up, in effect, all big security treaties in Europe. He tried to destroy the whole European security arrangement that they had helped negotiate and build and signed on to. And so what you had here were two tiers. You had Ukraine, important in itself, but for the Europeans, we had to sometimes remind them that above that was their own future. Europe whole, free, and at peace. Remember, was the mantra that we all used. And I remember talking to a representative in Moscow of a country whose name I won't mention, but it was like, hey, we've got all these businessmen, and part of our economy depends on this. And I said, yeah, but what about the principles? What about, standing up to these people? Trying to find a negotiation, give the Ukrainians the support that they need to negotiate. And, the interesting thing, I think, was some of this happened after Mariella and I left Moscow, but the Skripal poisonings and some of the other things like this really went to the core of what a lot of popular views were in Europe. I'm not an expert on this subject, but I got the sense that after a while that this kind of constant questioning, constant push to, hey, let's start pulling back on those sanctions. Hey, we got our business, come on, let's get on with life. You can tell where I stand on this, but that stuff kind of faded away a little bit. And I've not been in government now for 2 years, so I don't know quite where it is today, but I think the Germans and the French, they want to get an agreement, and I understand Vadim Prystaiko saying, I don't want this to, we're not going to just cave because the Germans and French want it. But, I hope that they'll continue to give support. John and I were at a conference, this YES conference in Ukraine, and I was asked to make a little short comment on Russia at one of the sessions. And there was all of this talk about the Europeans, and I said, hey, we should just get up and let the new Zelensky government have its chance to try to do this. Let's support them. Let's keep the leverage that they need to be able to possibly negotiate with Mr. Putin. And I think that's the right approach. Now we'll see what happens. There's no guarantees here, obviously, but that's what I would. Strategic patience is where I am at this point. Okay?
Excellent.